My name is Richard Epstein, and we're here to talk about a very provocative book by my good friend Ilya Somin called, roughly speaking, short and punchy, The Right to Move. And this topic essentially is much more comprehensive than that rather quiet title might suggest. If you try to figure out what is covered in this book, it's three major topics which get similarities and differences. The first of these topics is essentially the question of just how individuals kind of move from one firm to another. The second topic is how people move physically within a given polity, within a federal nation and so forth. And the third, and by far the most controversial situation, is the one that Ilya also defends, is the situation of being able to move as of right across national boundary lines. And so the question then is, how does one want to frame the cases and to start to work the analysis? One very nice point of departure is to ask this very simple question, which is, if you're in favor of free trade, why are you not afraid of free migration back and forth across national boundaries and so forth? Are there relevant differences? And if so, what are they? It's also the question, if you're going to ask about these three different modalities, they surely have something in common. Namely, if any individual is allowed to move, it's going to improve his or her preferences. The question is there some countervailing weight which would say that you're not going to allow that particular move to take place? The basic principle applies to three areas. It turns out that the counterweights themselves may be very different, which is why it is that this problem is one that starts to have some kind of a genuine sort of complexity. Then, in effect, when you start looking at this thing a little bit further, there are other kinds of questions having to do with the nature of the background, social practices, and norms that exist. And here, let me just mention a couple of them. There certainly was a very strong free movement of people into the United States between the years, roughly speaking, about 1890 to 1920, 1915, depending on when you count the end. And then all of a sudden, things started to shut down in the 1920s. Is it easier to have a system of free migration in a world in which transportation is very costly and which the benefits of a welfare state are relatively small, as opposed to a modern age in which there's substantial benefits of that kind, coupled with the obvious situation that mobility is vastly greater and cheaper than it was before? So if you start looking at all of this stuff, you then have to try to get both theoretical and empirical evidence on how this works. And Ilya begins to some extent his story with an anecdote. And I'm going to do the same thing to preempt, which is I was born April 17th, 1943. My parents were immigrants into the United States from the area sort of on the Russian-Polish border. 1819, April 19th was the day that the uprising started in the Warsaw Ghetto. And so the question of whether you're in the Brooklyn Jewish Hospital or in the middle of a free fire zone when you're 2 days old is something that really, really matters. And so Ilya has similar stories. He's going to take about, we'll say 20 to 25 minutes to talk. Rick Hills, always energetic on these subjects, a man never without an opinion, is going to comment for about 15 minutes. And after the two of them duke it out, I will come in and resolve all ambiguities in my favor in the last 5 or 6 minutes. Then we'll have a little interchange amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Ilya, why don't you just take it away?
Thank you very much for that exciting introduction, Richard, and to the Classical Liber Institute for hosting this event, and also to Rick Hills for what I know will be his insightful commentary. I'm now going to share my exciting PowerPoint presentation for this event so that you can see it in all its glory, if we can avoid technical difficulties with it, which I think we should be able to do. So here it is, and here you can start to see the presentation. This talk is based on my book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, which came out just last year from Oxford University Press. And it was somewhat ironic that I published a book on the value of freedom of movement right as most of the world was going into lockdown. So in one sense, you could say that was truly terrible timing. But in another sense, I hope that it has led people, at least some, to appreciate freedom of movement more than they might have otherwise. And the pain that we had hopefully temporarily, and having our freedom of movement restricted may make us more sensitive to the problems of people for whom essentially they're in lockdown all the time. That is, for their entire lives, by current arrangements, they are trapped in places where the government is oppressive, dysfunctional, unjust, or harmful in other ways. So at the start of the presentation, I'd just like to briefly mention, as Richard already has, the three types of foot voting that are discussed in the book, namely foot voting in a federal system, where you can choose what state or local government you want to live in based at least in part on its policies. Secondly, foot voting in the private sector, which is a less familiar type, but one that I'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes. Finally, foot voting through international migration, which is the most controversial type, as Richard rightly noted, but which also is the one that has the greatest gains. So it's particularly important, I think, to focus on that one. And finally, I will consider standard objections to expanding foot voting rights. Most of these today are deployed primarily against international migration, but if you take them seriously, they apply to internal freedom of movement as well. And that similarity, I think, is actually one of the reasons why we should reject most of these objections. But first things first, why should we even think of foot voting as an important mechanism of political freedom and political choice, given that we thought at least that we already have political choice at the ballot box, like in the way that we did in the November election, for example. We chose a new president and also many other officials at many different levels of government. So why isn't that enough? I think the answer is that ballot box voting has two very serious drawbacks. It has important benefits, certainly, but these drawbacks are significant as well. The first of these is that when you vote at the ballot box, your vote has only an infinitesimally small chance of making a difference. In an American presidential election, it's roughly 1 in 60 million. It can be somewhat higher if you live in a swing state, maybe even as high as 1 in 1 million or 1 in 2 million, much lower if, like Richard, you live in the state of New York, which is not a swing state at all. There it might be even much lower than the 1 in 60 million. Sorry, Richard, but that is the case. But even in the best case scenario, the chance is extremely low. And that's true even in smaller elections like state elections or local elections. And in most contexts, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom of choice if you have only a 1 in 60 million or 1 in 1 million chance of your decision actually making a difference to the outcome. We would not say you have meaningful freedom of religion if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of deciding what faith you want to practice. We would not say you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only that degree of a possibility of determining what viewpoints you're allowed to express, and so on. And I would suggest that the same thing is true of political freedom, that if you have only a 1 in 1 million or 1 in 60 million chance of being able to decide what policies you're going to live under, that's not very much political freedom at all. This problem of the inability to make a choice that actually is decisive is closely linked to the second big problem of ballot box voting, and that is the issue of people having incentives to be ignorant about the decisions that they make. Precisely because there's only a tiny chance of your vote making a difference, it turns out that most voters have very little incentive to acquire relevant political knowledge. And indeed, in this book, and even more so in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, I show how overwhelming empirical evidence shows that most voters are indeed ignorant in this way. For example, only about 1/3 of Americans can even name the three branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Similarly, although we have very serious fiscal problems both in the US and other countries, data consistently show that most voters, both in the US and also in European countries, don't know how the central government spends its money. They tend to greatly overestimate in their minds the percentage that is spent, for example, on foreign aid, while greatly underestimating the percentage that is spent on entitlement programs, which are in fact the largest items in the federal budget, along with defense. So the American Medical Association says that before a doctor is allowed to treat you, in most cases, they have to get your informed consent. political decisions about government policy also are often life or death matters. We certainly have seen this during the COVID crisis, but even during normal times, it's true. Yet, because of widespread political ignorance, very rarely, if ever, do government decisions ever actually have anything approaching informed consent. In reality, the normal practice of democratic government is that it's like a doctor whose ministrations you are not allowed to refuse, and most of the patients have very little idea of whether the treatment really is addressing a disease or whether instead it's a form of snake oil. This state of affairs, I think, should be troubling. On the other hand, foot voting has major advantages on both of these criteria. When you choose where you're going to live in a federal system, or you make decisions in the private sector, that's a choice that, if you're allowed to make it, has a big impact on the outcome. It really is a decisive choice. In some cases, of course, you might have to make that choice in consultation with your family, with a spouse, for example, but even so, you probably have a lot more influence in that family decision than you would in any kind of ballot box voting decision. And the same goes for seeking out relevant information, precisely because foot voting decisions are ones that actually make a difference or have a high probability of doing so. Most people take them more seriously and seek out information to a much greater extent than when they vote at the ballot box. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time seeking out relevant information the last time you decided what television set to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other political office. That's not because your TV is more important than who is the president, or that it deals with more complicated issues. It's because you know that the TV you choose is probably the one that will end up in your living room. But when you turn on the TV and you have the misfortune of seeing the president of the United States or some other politician, your chances of influencing who that is are extraordinarily low, and therefore you likely devote far less time and effort to considering that decision. In the book, I discuss how these advantages of foot voting over ballot box voting translate into superiority under a range of different theories of political freedom. And by the way, not just or even primarily purely libertarian theories. While I myself am a libertarian, the book does not rely on any distinctively libertarian assumptions. A wide range of assumptions from within the liberal tradition more broadly are more than good enough for me to be able to make my case. And I'm happy in questions to talk about specific theories of political freedom and how my approach translates into an advantage for foot voting with regard to those theories, and not just some weird, nutty libertarian theory that I might come up with, or a less nutty libertarian theory that Richard Epstein or some other libertarian scholar might come up with, and so forth. If you like those theories, great. But even if you don't, my analysis has something to offer you, I hope. So I'd like to now take a closer look at the specific types of foot voting discussed in the book. And first up is foot voting under federalism, the kind that we normally think of when we consider foot voting. A foot voting under federalism potentially offers tremendous advantages and choices to many people. In the US, we have 50 state governments and almost 90,000 local governments of various kinds. That's a wide range of potential options, much wider and richer than what you can get, say, in choosing between the two major parties at the national level. And potentially, you stand a much better chance of finding a jurisdiction that fits your preferences reasonably well. Historically, as discussed in more detail in the book, foot voting in federal systems has been a particular boon to the poor, the disadvantaged, unpopular minorities of various kinds. Throughout American history, many such groups have bettered their condition greatly precisely through foot voting. I give quite a number of different examples in the book, some well known, such as the movement of African Americans out of the Jim Crow South, some less known, but still, I think, significant. In the book, I discuss how foot voting under federalism has tremendous advantages, even if there isn't necessarily any competition going on. So even if jurisdictions aren't making any special effort to attract migrants, it is still the case that if there's a diversity of different kinds of policies and options, there can be important benefits to foot voting. But obviously the benefits are even greater if jurisdictions are in fact incentivized to compete. And in chapter 2 in the book, I discuss some ways that that can be heightened. I also talk about this in chapter 7 and in some of my previous work. Rick Hills and I have had occasion to discuss these issues in the past, and I'm sure perhaps we'll do so again today. I do recognize that, especially in recent decades in the United States and in some other nations, some new and, in my view, highly pernicious obstacles to foot voting in the federal system have arisen. The biggest is perhaps exclusionary zoning, which makes it difficult or impossible in many areas to build new housing in response to demand. And in the book, I propose ways to alleviate that and also to alleviate some other potential obstacles to foot voting in federal systems, such as, in some cases, high moving costs. I also discuss such counter arguments as concerns about races to the bottom and claims that foot voting is bad for racial and ethnic minorities. I'm happy to discuss that further in the questions. But for now, I'd like to press on and talk about foot voting in the private sector. Many people, even those who otherwise like voting with your feet, they may not even think about the private sector as a possible option. But in reality, we do have lots of institutions in the private sector that provide services that are often similar to those provided by state or local governments. The best example is private planned communities, homeowners associations, condominiums, and others, which routinely provide things like security protection, environmental amenities, sometimes educational and recreational services, and many other things traditionally associated with local governments. The data suggests that we now have almost 70 million Americans who live in these sorts of organizations, and this has important advantages even over foot voting under federalism. One is that there are many more of these sorts of private communities than there are states or even localities, and therefore it offers many more options, and also lower moving costs, because often you can include a wide range of these institutions within a relatively small geographic area. In addition, evidence suggests that the services provided by private planned communities are often better in quality than similar ones provided by state or local governments. For example, the security services they employ don't have anything like the same level of problems with racial profiling and brutality as public police do. And if they do violate your rights, they're not protected by qualified immunity. So you can sue them and get damages far more easily. The standard argument against these sorts of institutions is, well, only the rich can do this, and it's only wealthy people and everybody else is basically shut out. Robert B. Reich famously called this the secession of the successful. I think this is already not true even in the status quo. We don't have 70 million very wealthy people in the US unless you have a very expansive definition of what qualifies as wealthy. But I do recognize that this form of social organization is not as readily available to the poor or the lower middle class. And in the book, I propose various reforms to make it more available. Again, I'm happy to talk about it in questions. It is not my view that private planned communities or any kind of private institutions, I do talk about other kinds of private sector foot voting as well, but it is not my view that these institutions can completely displace state or local governments, nor do I think that state and local governments can completely displace the federal government. But we can decentralize a lot of functions much more than we currently do, both to the state and local level, but also to the private sector without losing much, if anything, in the way of economies of scale or other potential benefits of centralization. And again, I can talk about that more in the questions if people are interested. So between them, foot voting in federal systems and foot voting in the private sector, to the extent we were able to expand that, that can greatly enhance political freedom and human happiness for many millions of people. I'd now like to go on to talk about international migration, which of course is the most controversial of the three types of foot voting, but also the ones where there are the greatest gains. The reason why the gains are so large is because the difference in quality of government between nations is often far larger than any divergence within a country. So think about whatever you think is the best governed American state and compare it to whatever you think is the worst governed there's probably a substantial difference, but it's not nearly as great as these kinds of differences. The difference between Cuba and the United States, or the difference between war-torn Syria and the United States, or between nations like this and countries like Canada, nations in Western Europe, and so forth. Here, the differences are truly enormous on any dimension of political freedom or other types of freedom. Consider racial and ethnic minorities or religious ones fleeing persecution. Consider dissidents fleeing brutal authoritarian regimes, women fleeing patriarchal societies, and so on and so forth. The difference is just like night and day. Indeed, the terms like night and day understate how big the difference is. And I would add, for the roughly 1/3 of the world's population who live under dictatorships, for them, foot voting through international migration is really the only mode of political freedom or political choice that they can realistically have at all. They don't even have the option of the very limited freedom that we enjoy through ballot box voting in the United States. This also translates to enormous economic gains. The standard estimate of economists, which I discuss in more detail in the book, is that if we had free migration throughout the world, we would have, the world would be roughly twice as wealthy as it currently is. That is, world GDP would double. How can you have such an enormous increase? Is because many millions of people are currently trapped in societies where the government is so oppressive, so corrupt, so unjust, that no matter how hard those people work or no matter how smart they are, they still have little or no chance of escaping poverty. By contrast, the data shows that when a person like this crosses into the US or Western Europe or some other relatively free society, they almost immediately can double or triple their productivity. And that doesn't even take into account improvements in human capital and skills over time, which also are likely to be greater in a freer and wealthier society than in the countries where they come from. Now, despite these enormous gains, there are obviously lots of objections to freedom of movement through international migration. And as I will discuss, almost all of these objections apply to domestic freedom of movement as well. And I'd like to first start with objections which say that governments just have a general right to exclude people. They don't even necessarily have to have a good reason. They can just exclude them. The most common form of that argument is the idea that every part of the world, or at least most parts, are really the property of a particular ethnic or racial or cultural group, like in the French nationalist poster on the screen right now, which says La France aux Français, France for the French. The idea is that France is the property of ethnically French people. The ethnic French have the right to exclude anybody else, like the English, the Germans, or really anyone, because they are the true owners of the land. And I think this idea, while very common, has many flaws. Here, I'll just mention a couple big ones. The first is when you look at the actual history of almost every place in the world, it is simply not true that you can trace it back to a particular ethnic group, which was the unique population of that era, of that area, and everybody else is just an interloper. In reality, virtually all of these places have had a variety of different ethnic and cultural groups, and to the extent that one has become dominant, it is very often through conquest or forcible displacement rather than through any kind of inherent right of ownership. But even if you set aside that sort of history, there's still a very deep problem with this argument, in that if you take it seriously, it is an argument for racial and ethnic discrimination. In the domestic context, we readily reject things like racial segregation as it was practiced for far too long in the US, or South African apartheid. We say that this kind of racial discrimination is unjust because of the fact that race and ethnicity are ultimately morally irrelevant characteristics that nobody can control, whether they're born Black or white or Hispanic or Anglo and so forth. And in addition, whether you're born into one of these groups or a member of it says nothing about your moral worth. It says nothing about how much freedom you should be entitled to. So if we reject this at the domestic level for all of these very good reasons that I just summarized, all of those points also apply to the international level. That there's nothing magical about nation states which suddenly make racial and ethnic discrimination legitimate at that level, even though it's illegitimate internally. All the same points apply in both contexts. More generally, we today reject the system of medieval feudalism where your freedom of movement depended on whether you were a serf or a noble. And if you were a noble, you could move around pretty freely. On the other hand, if you were a serf, you could only move around if the nobles let you. What was the difference between nobles and serfs? What was the mistake that the serfs had made that caused them to be in this situation? Is that they had the wrong parents. And they chose the wrong parents, whereas the nobles chose the right ones. We readily see why this is unjust in the case of domestic feudalism and why that system had to be rejected. But we currently have a system of international feudalism where for most people, where they're allowed to live depends on who they chose as their parents. If your parents were American citizens or you were born in the United States, you can live in the US. Otherwise, you're out of luck unless the government makes a special exception for you, just like nobles would sometimes make special exceptions for particular serfs that were especially favored. The other type of argument that we often hear for a general right to exclude is the idea that a nation is like a house or a club. You hear this argument often, particularly in the US. And so just like a homeowner has the right to exclude people and doesn't necessarily have to have a good reason, or a private club can exclude people if they want to. So similarly, maybe a national government is like a homeowner or like the proprietor of a private club. There are many problems with this argument, but here I'll just mention one. If you take this analogy seriously, it has dire implications, not just for immigrants, but also for natives. The owner of a home can say, I only allow my preferred religion to be practiced here. I only allow, say, pro-Democratic Party political speech or pro-Republican speech. And if a national government has the same rights as a homeowner or the proprietor of a club, then they could repress natives in all sorts of ways, just as they could repress immigrants. And this alone is a good reason for rejecting this analogy, though there are some other reasons as well. Many people argue that even if there isn't a justification for a general right to exclude, there's we should still be able to exclude people if they might cause particular types of harms, like overburdening the welfare state, increasing crime, spreading harmful cultural values, and so forth. I don't have time to go over all of these sorts of objections in detail, though I do in the book. I'll just mention my general framework for addressing them. First, you should ask, how big is this problem really? Often it turns out it's not much of a problem. For example, with the welfare state objection, when you do cross-national studies, it turns out that places with more immigrants don't actually have more welfare spending per capita. The vast majority of immigrants are actually net fiscal contributors. But let's say you do this analysis, it turns out there is a problem. Still, you should ask, is there a keyhole solution? That is a way to address the problem by means less draconian than excluding people. And very often there is. I present lots of keyhole solutions for lots of different problems in the book. But for instance, in a welfare case, you can simply make immigrants ineligible or only partially eligible for various welfare benefits, as we in the US already in fact do under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And I have similar keyhole solutions for arguments that immigrants might vote for bad political candidates and the like as well. Finally, let's say there is a problem and there is no keyhole solution that is likely to work. Still, as I mentioned earlier, migration creates lots of additional wealth. We can tap some of that wealth to alleviate potential negative side effects of migration. So if you believe, for instance, that immigrant workers displace native workers and those native workers deserve compensation, you can tap some of the wealth created by migration, increase the earned income tax credit or other wage subsidies for whatever category of native workers you think should be entitled to them. I don't claim this framework can fully address every conceivable problem, but it does address virtually all of the ones that are most commonly raised. And I would note simply, while it's not in the book, this is actually also true for the coronavirus and the spreading of disease. I have an article in The Atlantic where I talk about this. The very last point that I would make before turning the floor over to Rick and Richard is that all of the objections that I just raised and discussed with respect to international migration apply to internal freedom of movement as well. If you believe that the US is like a club or a house, maybe Texas can be like a club or a house too, and should be able to exclude Californians. If you believe that the dominant ethnic or racial group of France can exclude people, why not the dominant ethnic or racial group of Quebec or California or some other state? If you believe that we can exclude people to overburden the welfare state, then perhaps we should prevent West Virginians from moving to Virginia. West Virginia is much poorer than we are. They could overburden our welfare state. And I can make similar points about pretty much every other standard objection that is made. It is not my view that freedom of movement should always be absolute in every conceivable circumstance, but there should be a strong presumption in favor of it. And in most cases, current migration restrictions, both domestic and international, don't have anything like the kind of weighty justifications that would be required to overcome that presumption. On that note, I conclude, but I really look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Well, we have a very virtuous speaker in Ilya. And now what we're going to do is to have Rick give some kind of comments for about 15 minutes, and then I'll talk for about 5 to 10. Rick, it's all yours.
Hey there, can you hear me? Does this thing work? I'm always amazed. Ilya, that was great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to come out here and chat with us. As you know, I'm not a very good commenter because I agree with so much of what you say. Nothing is worse than a tennis opponent who simply lobs slow, high balls near the baseline. What good does that do? Who wants to watch that? And so what I'd like to do is push you on something that's not as much in your book as it would seem, given how much I'm going to press it. Not that it's the most important point. Might be the basis for a second book or another book, because you've written so many. But I would want to ask a little bit about practical politics and say a little bit less about normative theory. Much of your book is really great in explaining why, for instance, conventional arguments for cultural self-determination aren't very persuasive when you're trying to justify the power of a nation to exclude newcomers. And I like those arguments. You've got great ones in chapter 5. One argument goes, look, you assume that this group of people has some kind of right of cultural self-determination, but they disagree with each other about what their culture entails. So excluding all newcomers is not really helping them determine their shared culture. It's simply allowing one side of a culture war to call the shots for the nation. I like those arguments. But what I'd like to focus a little bit on, I'm really interested in what you have to say about it, is taking for granted that, right or wrong, a majority of active political participants, which is certainly not a majority of citizens or even a majority of voters, but a majority of, I'll call them the political nation, can in fact call the shots on grounds like cultural self-determination or economic fears. And therefore, I'm curious about, especially in your chapter 6 keyhole solutions, the degree do you think it's practically and morally acceptable to accommodate their desires, however morally unjust, and also their beliefs, however factually incorrect? And the reason I say this is because we're just coming out of a period of enormous backlash to an effort of extraordinary, by international standards, libertarianism in immigration. Since the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, the United States has catapulted to the top of nations in terms of percentage of foreign-born. We have almost 15% of our population foreign-born. Now, I spend roughly a third of the year in China. In China, the number is roughly, depending upon how you count, 1/10 of 1%. There are almost no Waiguaran, even in Shanghai, a city of 23 million people. About maybe 250,000 are foreign-born. And so a question might be, to what extent do you want your theory to take into account the danger that if you let in a lot of people, or make arguments that they'll be harmless, that are rational arguments and factually backed arguments, that you'll inspire a Trump-style backlash that could cause more exclusion? And one answer you might give, and I really am curious about hearing this answer, is whether your keyhole solutions could be tailored to deal with this backlash. Like, for instance, you notice that lots of people worry about political externalities. And by political externality, you mean, well, a whole bunch of people with different political beliefs are going to come here, and then they're going to outvote me. And so all of a sudden, I'm going to belong to a minority political party when once I controlled the system. And you note, and these are great factual points, the chance of that is actually pretty small. You'd have to have a huge number of people not merely migrate here, but vote in exactly the same way. And that typically doesn't happen. But nevertheless, people believe it happens. Doesn't really matter if it doesn't happen, if the people who believe it happens can control an election. Now, if they buy your book and read it, right? That's one answer, you know. But as you know, the capacity to increase the information level of voters, and more importantly, the politically active community, is actually pretty small, right? In other words, we're in the political system, we're not working in a foot voting system. And so even if we can persuade them to buy their book, will they read it? And even if they read your book, will they understand it? So given the possibility that factually incorrect beliefs and strong prejudice will motivate our immigrant system, what do you think of the following modifications? And I don't know if they're total modifications, if your keyhole solutions suggest. So you notice with political externalities, there's a real injustice in excluding people on the ground that if we brought them in here, they would vote in an improper way. But you say, we could at least make this concession. We let them come in here, but we don't give them the franchise until a very long time, or at least a much longer time than, say, 5 years. And that still leaves them in a better position than they would be if they came here, or if they were excluded altogether. So it's a kind of a compromise. Keyhole solutions tend to be compromises. That's true, but I think, now I'm going to try to speak for a Trump supporter. Their response will be, at least in the United States, their children get to vote as soon as they come of age. They're automatically citizens. So we should also get rid of soil citizenship. Why? Well, because that'll reduce again, I'm going to speak as a Trump voter, my anxiety about a political externality. And you might say, well, that anxiety is both unjust and unrealistic, but we know that it's felt. So would you be willing to modify a keyhole solution to get rid of things like soil citizenship, also known as birthright citizenship? Even if the externality is small, given that it's perceived to be very large. Likewise, on some of your keyhole solutions, and they're very interesting keyhole solutions, you notice that many people fear that immigrants will bring in crime. Now, again, the factually accurate position is if you want to lower crime, let in a lot of immigrants. Indeed, let in a lot of illegal immigrants. That is to say, I hate that term, but I'm trying to be a Trump voter right now. But translated into reasonable English, let in a lot of people whose presence is unlawful under the Immigration and Naturalization Act. And you actually lower crime quite a bit, because it turns out their rate of committing crime is much lower, even not controlling for socioeconomic status, interestingly enough. In other words, a whole bunch of unlawfully present people from, say, Mexico, who are working class and don't have a college education, they're less likely to commit crimes than people who have a better education and a higher income. So that's the true Ilya position, but it's not believed. And so, would it make sense to give states and even individual cities the right to have their own immigration policy? And at the border, have their own visa controls and say, yeah, you've been admitted to, New York City, but you haven't been admitted to Alabama. Again, getting admitted to New York City without having the right to move to Alabama is better than being excluded altogether. So isn't that a good keyhole solution? You note that worries about cultural change are overblown because, of course, a culture can change internally. Now, your average Trump supporter might say, yeah, but I can control that because I control the education of my kids. And I use investments in cultural capital, such as what kind of history I teach in the schools, to make sure that cultural change is in some sense under their control. Now, this is remarkably naive. I'm the father of 2 daughters, and I assure you that my capacity to control their cultural beliefs through education of any sort is quite minimal. Nevertheless, you can imagine, again, an immigration screening system where we said, okay, well, fine, we're going to give them cultural tests. And we're going to screen people out who don't meet certain cultural tests, again, to placate fears that otherwise will prevent immigration altogether. So that's just 3 keyholes that you don't, I think, endorse, but might be within the spirit of trying to accommodate practical backlash worries. And I'd just be very interested in what you have to say about them. In general, I'm with you 100%. And there's another solution besides accommodating these worries, and that is doing immigration reform on the sly. In fact, I'll close with just this quick remark. I hope it's quick. It turns out that the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 revolutionized immigration by accident. The person who amended the act, and LBJ, who was very eager to get rid of the national origins quota system, fought with this guy and took him onto the plane and gave him the LBJ treatment. But the person who liberalized immigration in the United States the most was a guy named Representative Fagan, who was unbelievably anti-immigrant. And so he said, okay, I'll allow liberalization of visas to let more people come here, but I want to make sure that family members get top preference. And he told LBJ quite freely why he thought this. He thought that family members would tend to be Western European, mostly Irish. Well, of course, that's how it had been earlier. So he said anybody who was a family member, they should be able to bring family members in, sponsor them, without limits that were otherwise imposed by the Hart-Celler Act. Of course, the family member exception, which is designed to keep immigrants white and Western European and English speaking, was precisely what has liberalized immigration to the point where we have almost 15% foreign born today. And the vast majority of immigrants coming in today are from Asia, used to be from Mexico, but Representative Fagan's expectations were not met. So another solution is simply to devise sneaky ways. And it's not democratic, but as you know, democracy is not so great, as an information system. And you could say it's dishonest and that's unethical. But you know what also is unethical? Keeping people out of this country. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that too. Sneakiness and broad keyhole solutions that might be slightly skeevy and unethical. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Richard, I think you're muted.
No, I'm not. Yes. Yeah, look, I'm going to try to make just a very few remarks. And in a strange sense, I'm going to do what Rick did, but in a very different way, being more theoretical. One of the things I think one has to worry about this is the following clear paradox. If you were to ask people in the United States whether or not they would favor the reimposition of barriers that would prevent movement back and forth across states, I think the number of people who would support that would be very, very small. So many people move so much that we realize that reciprocal movement across borders really matters. Exit rights under federalism turn out to be in many cases more powerful than reform. It's clear that you cannot escape a bad zoning situation if you're the owner of property, but it's equally clear that if you're a developer, you could play off one jurisdiction against another. And so what we do is we have this, it was very much a part of the American constitutional framework with respect to movements back and forth across state lines. On the other hand, if you were to try to get a popular consensus with respect to international immigration back and forth, I don't think there's any place in the entire world in which Ilya's position would have even a toehold minority with respect to this. There would be enormous differences as to what particular policies that one would want to have, but the clear essence of a nation is your right to exclude, and then that's supposed to be absolute, and then you could figure out why or why not. So what do I think are the theoretical issues that we have to worry about? One is I think that Ilya is very astute to talk to the gains about those people who want to leave one company that they can gain from immigration. The question as to where they go, however, is a very different question from where they're from. And so the issue is, should the company that holds them be allowed to keep them in there? And again, I think it's a real sign of tyranny to say that you make captive citizens. But the question of getting into another place, does every place have to take you in as a matter of right? Oddly enough, if every place was willing to let you in, I think the problem would be much less acute than it is under the current circumstances, where it turns out there are relatively few numbers of nations which are prepared to do that. And so then what we have to do is we start to look at this is why the fears that we start to see. And let's just talk about a couple of calamitous situations that have taken place, most of which involve the Middle East. So if you go back and see the organization of the Arab-Israeli Palestine immigrations and so forth, I mean, the British had a policy of excluding all immigrants from Western Europe, Jewish, at the end of the war, all sorts of bloodshed, getting people in and out. But the situation there was not just a question of letting people in so that they could ply their economic trade. There was this huge fear on the part of the Arabs that a large insurgent Jewish population would wrest control of the political system away from them and would result in essentially the advancement of a set of religion, practices, and beliefs that they regarded as an anathema in many, many cases. And so the violence and bloodshed that one started to see was there. Even looking at it more recently, the breakoff of Hamas in 2005 or so, there have been 4 cross-border wars that have taken place. Open immigration in a place like Israel is simply not going to work. If you put yourself in as a Jewish state, you cannot allow that. If other states have strong religious identities, it's not going to work either. If you're a small company and you're sitting on a full power of oil and so forth, you may let foreigners come in and run. But many of these nations in Bahrain and so forth, they often have rules that say the only people who are citizens are not people born in the country. That's never allowed. But they have to have 2 parents of national origin, not even one, because they're so jealous of all of that. If you then look a little bit later into the situation as it existed with the migration, which happened about 4 or 5 years ago, large numbers of Arabs, typically young males, going into European countries, you start to see again just an enormous amount of stuff because it's a very different pattern of immigration from the one that happened to the United States, say in 1910, where you had families coming in. All of the care that was given to them was by an organization, at least on the Jewish side, called HIAS, a Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which met every boat and took care of every person coming off those boats without the federal government or the state governments being involved in any way with respect to the short-term care. The welfare system was very much less developed than that. But now suppose what we do is we don't sort of treat these as independent, autonomous decisions made separately by various people in various ways. And I do think you have to ask the question. Suppose it turns out that China wants to get rid of its population, and essentially what it does is 1 million airplane tickets for individuals to come into the United States and to land at LaGuardia Airport and to seek housing and so forth at that particular location. The question of absorption, I think, really depends upon the rate and the frequency with which this starts to take place. And you're going to be taxing all sorts of infrastructure institutions of one kind or another. So what is gradual absorption over time, like, for example, with the great Negro immigration to the North, which took place roughly between 1915 and 1975, which Isabel Wilkinson really gives a very powerful portrait of and so forth, with something that's relatively easy. The occasional acts of violence that you start to see and some of the ugliness you can get rid of. I think Lily is right about the zoning restrictions. You have to deal with them. And the violence, of course, is always inexcusable. But you start doing these sort of massive transformations and so forth. It's not going to matter whether you could vote or not vote. It's just not possible to run a governance system where all of a sudden you have parked in a given community 100,000 people who come from overseas, speak a different language, have different religions, different cultures, and so forth. And so what one has seen is an initial reception inside the European Union to take people in. And then you start to see, as Rick kind of hinted, really serious backlashes. Don't let anybody come into here from these particular places and so forth. And so I'm not in favor of a completely open policy. What I'm in favor of is a managed policy. And I want to make it very clear. In general, I'm quite sympathetic to trying to have people come in as immigrant status into the United States. What was said about crime rates is surely true. Civic participation is surely true. If you then start to look at this, not on the family side, but also on the occupational side, it seems to me just madness in the United States to have people come here, get trainings, and send them away. If you're worried about having sudden spurts of population come in that you can't control, the last group that would qualify as that would be the dreamers, where in fact you could change the citizenship or the eligibility rules in a very smart and continuous way without any of these kinds of situations. And so I think in effect what happens is if you really push to the extreme, it's not going to be saleable in any way, shape, or form. I think what one has to do is to take a different kind of a situation, namely a situation in which you understand the presumption in favor of immigration, try to pick your stops of opportunity where you think it's going to be greatest, try to reduce the anxieties on the other side. it's also important, and I'll end on this particular note, and then I'm going to ask Ilya for some responses, is that there is, I think, a very important relationship between free trade on the one hand and free immigration on the other. I'm very hard pressed to find reasons why free trade should be disbarred. People say it's going to cost American jobs. My view is if the people don't come in on the free trade side, what's going to happen? Those jobs will disappear anyhow. They'll go somewhere else inside the community, or they'll just fail in bankruptcy. So I think, in effect, larger pies create more opportunities, and these doomsday scenarios start to cement. So if you, in fact, increase free trade, what you do is you reduce the pressure for immigration. Most people would rather not immigrate because what they do is they have to give up their native language, their family, their associations, their friends, and so forth. And so I think that the most important solution is to try to get this thing on the trade. So that's about all that I wish to say. But Ilya, I do want to start with this last question, is sort of take the counter examples of immigration patterns that seem to have generated a fierce response, mass movements from so forth. Places like, for example, Denmark becoming highly intolerant of immigrants after welcoming them in, because essentially they cluster in small communities. They don't share the general social norm. All the situation with marriage, sexuality, behaviors, and so forth in communities seem to create a lot of dislocation. And can you believe that it's possible with your regime to overcome these mass movements between wildly divergent cultures of the sort that I've mentioned? So we'll open up for that. Then Rick, you could take a shot. And if you have a question of Ilya, by all means, ask it.
Sure.
Okay?
So thank you, both of you, for your very thoughtful comments. I'll start, as Richard suggested, with his last question, which I think is actually also tied in with the very first point that Richard mentioned about the contrast between movement between states and movement between nations. I think Richard is right that we now, in the US at least, take for granted that freedom of movement between states is a good thing that should be allowed. That wasn't always true in American history. In fact, in the 19th century, as Richard probably knows, many states actually had laws specifically excluding even free blacks, not just slaves, but free blacks. They also had laws trying to exclude what they in that time called paupers, people who might be likely to become public dependents and the like. And the rationales used for that was actually much the same as the rationales Richard just mentioned about problems of absorption, economic adjustment, and so forth. And by the way, when the great migration of African Americans began to the north in the late 19th, early 20th century, these arguments were raised then as well, and were part of the reason for the enactment of exclusionary zoning regimes. What you just said about clustering of immigrants in Denmark, that exact same argument was made to try to exclude African Americans from northern cities. They might cluster in particular neighborhoods, cause social problems of various kinds, cause riots and conflict. All of these arguments were used. They were even used in the Supreme Court case of Buchanan versus Worley, which ultimately struck down racially restrictive zoning. But the argument was used that we got to have it, otherwise there will be conflict, there will be too many people moving in, and so forth. And that leads to my point about the calamities as Richard describes them. I would say a couple of things about them. One is there's a long history of short-term problems and large, medium, and long-term gains from mass migration. And even in the European cases that you mentioned, most of the immigrants in question have become vastly better off. They've become more productive. They've made important contributions to their host societies. In a couple of cases, they've even played a big role in the development of the coronavirus vaccines that we're now benefiting from. The developers of the Pfizer vaccine, or the German part of it, are immigrants to Germany from Middle Eastern Muslim nations. To the extent that the Europeans have had problems with this, and they certainly have had some, it is in part because they, in many countries, have closed labor markets, something that Richard in other contexts rightly criticizes. Those closed labor markets make them people less productive than they otherwise would be. They also, for obvious reasons, impede assimilation. This is something I talk about in chapter 6 of the book. One reason why the US has done much better with respect to immigrants, both from the Muslim world and elsewhere than some of these European nations, is because we have relatively more flexible labor markets than they do. And those kind of labor market reforms are desirable even if you don't have very much immigration. So it's not even an adjustment to immigration, it's just something that's desirable in general. As for some of the other so-called calamities that Richard mentions, like the situation in the Middle East, to my mind, the calamity there is not because of freedom of movement, but because people were using force to prevent freedom of movement. If both Jews and Arabs were able to migrate freely, and live peacefully, many of these problems, not all, but many, would fall away. And certainly I do not believe that we should cater to the desire of oppressive regimes and societies that feel threatened by migration because they think that might undermine that oppressive situation. Now, Richard says he actually is in favor of much more open migration, but it's going to be managed to absorption capacity. I would just, in response, I would just point to Richard's works on pretty much every other topic that he writes about, where he takes, in my view, a rightly skeptical view of government, quote unquote, management of economic and social problems. To my mind, the better form of management is through free markets and civil society. So it's unlikely that you would get 100,000 people in one place all at once, because there would be some limits on that by housing markets, employment opportunities, and so on. And in a large nation like the US, that would give incentives for migrants to try some other places if, one, there was already, housing prices had risen. I discuss these issues in somewhat greater detail in chapter 6 of the book. I can only briefly summarize here, but that would be the general gist of my answer about both the European situation specifically and the idea of migration caused calamity generally. I would add actually that in the late 19th and early 20th century US, we did in fact have the equivalent of many hundreds of thousands of people arriving every year, forming a larger proportion of the population being immigrants than is currently the case. And that was in a much poorer society with much fewer resources available to adjust. So if that adjustment was made successfully then, we actually have a greater ability to make it now. And I would note that studies by the National Academy of Sciences and other experts show that, in fact, immigration absorption happens at roughly the same pace today as it did then. And this is particularly true even for the Hispanic immigrants, who are often, it is claimed, they don't assimilate or absorb. That's actually just not true. And I can go into more detail about why it isn't. Now, turning to Rick's points, and also to some extent Richard's points about backlash and the like, I am willing to adopt keyhole solutions in places where A, there is a real problem, and B, there isn't a less restrictive way to address it. And I mentioned several keyhole solutions in the book. Some of the ones Rick mentions are actually similar to ones that I mentioned. You could potentially, instead of denying the franchise for 5 years, you could do it for 10 or whatnot, if there really was a good case for doing it. I am reluctant to adopt keyhole solutions that aren't really necessary from the standpoint of solving an actual problem just for the purpose of quiescing public opinion. I don't categorically rule this out as a matter of principle, but the reason for my skepticism, which I've written about elsewhere, is like this, that it is often said, well, immigration increases, but then you get a backlash and you might get less, or you might get illiberal political movements that are harmful generally. But if you actually look at the survey data on whether people even know how much immigration there is, what you find is that people vastly overestimate it. And nationalist types who are likely to engage in backlash, they overestimated even more than other people. So it doesn't follow that if you had, say, 10% less immigration, you would get 10% less opposition, because most of those people most likely to oppose it, they don't even know how much immigration there is, not because they're stupid, but for the reasons of rational voter ignorance that I mentioned earlier. And I think the same thing is true for their knowledge of a lot of these other kinds of keyhole solutions. How many of them will we even know how long an immigrant has to wait before they become eligible to vote? How many of them will even know what immigrants' eligibility for welfare benefits is, and so forth? Again, as I said earlier, I am open to keyhole solutions where they will actually fix a problem, but using them to sort of quiesce public opinion, I want to see stronger evidence than at least so far I've seen that they actually do work in that way. That leaves the question from the beginning of Rick's presentation: well, how would I try to move the ball politically on this? My book is not a book about political strategy. It doesn't lay out a definitive strategy for the Biden administration or for whoever else about how to liberalize immigration policy. But I do note a few things about this in the book. One is that if you look both in the US and in Western Europe, younger and more highly educated people tend to be more pro-immigration. We can take advantage of that. Obviously, by definition, those people would be a higher percentage of the population over time. By the way, when I talk about younger people, this is not a cohort effect that is the one where when you're young, you're pro-immigration, and when you're old, you aren't, is that each succeeding generation is more pro-immigration than the previous one. Like they're also more pro-same-sex marriage or pro-marijuana legalization. Those are other somewhat similar phenomena. The other point I would mention is we could learn from the successful, at least to a large extent, struggle against racism, sexism, and homophobia, where over time we have it took a long time and it was difficult, but more and more people came to realize that being of a particular race, in many respects, not all, but in many, being a man as opposed to a woman, or being gay as opposed to straight, these are morally arbitrary characteristics. We shouldn't, that fundamentally gays and straights are similar, men and women with some obvious differences are similar, blacks and whites and so on, and that where you're born or who your parents are, whether you were born on one side of the line or map or another, this is much the same kind of characteristic. And I think this message, which I have an article about this, but I haven't written about it in the book, this is the kind of message that we want to push over time, which is not to say that it will succeed immediately or that there won't be periods of backlash, but I think this is a more promising strategy than trying to quiesce opposition by having targeted keyhole solutions, which much of the relevant public won't even be aware of and won't pay attention to the details of. So how many Trump voters even know that immigrants are already ineligible for many welfare benefits? Some probably do know, but a great many do not. Similar, and I can say the same kinds of things about some of these other things. Finally, Rick mentions the issue of letting states have their own visa policies. Actually do raise this point in chapter 7 of the book, and such a policy does exist in Canada and also in Australia. I'm open to it, and actually there's a provision in Joe Biden's immigration bill which creates a limited degree of that. Some Republicans have also proposed that. My only caveat is that this should be on top of whatever number of people are let in through the normal process rather than instead of it. Finally, sneaky immigration policy. I haven't thought about that one so much. I'm not opposed to it on principle, but I'd have to think more about how it would work and whether it's actually viable over time.
Rick, do you have any comments?
Well, just to agree with Ilya that political ignorance is such that if you're going to use keyholes, you want to make sure that they don't depend upon direct voter knowledge, right? I wouldn't try to bill a keyhole as, oh, if voters were aware of this, it would have some kind of effect. Instead, I'd bill keyholes as this keyhole will lead to voters being less aware of immigration. So, an obvious way to do this would be to have a kind of dispersion policy so that voters of Arizona don't think there's going to be a taco truck on every corner. Now, I personally would love a taco truck on every corner.
You like tacos.
I like tacos. I also like Jinbing and a whole bunch of other stuff. But there's this great Russian dumpling place on 6th Avenue now. Basically saved my life during the COVID. But the idea is, whatever policy you pick, make sure that it hides. It hides, for instance, deconcentrating immigrants. A bunch of guys sitting on a street corner where the pickup truck picks them up, that's going to piss people off. I like a liquid labor market. I like to see the pickup truck. It looks good to me, but it doesn't look good to a lot of my fellow citizens. And so I want to see a way we can smuggle that in. On being deceptive, I just want to emphasize, keep in mind that our revolution in immigration, which is by far greater to my knowledge than any other countries except for some tiny little place like Singapore, by far greater, was created by a person who hated immigration.
Well, I mean, one never wants to talk about unanticipated consequences of purposive action, right? Which this turns out to be an example of. And indeed, people like Gary Becker have urged when he was alive that, that Canada should sell its immigration slots to people from Hong Kong in order to bring in a superior class of laborers and so forth and to reduce the immigration burden. I don't know, Ejan, whether you could give me some questions, but I'll make one kind of observation myself. I'm going to try to outdo Ilya by being even more libertarian than he is, at least on one point. I am very uneasy about the situation of having permanent people in the United States who are going to have two different classes of relationships to the polity at large. To have a situation, particularly say in local government, where you're not allowed to vote in a local election, but the real estate taxes that are going to be charged are going to be there. And then the question is, if you can't vote, can you speak at a zoning hearing and things of that particular sort? I think having a kind of a quasi-caste system inside a country is actually quite a dangerous situation. So the idea of prolonging the transition period is one that I think is more dangerous. I do say, by the way, I think historically the arguments against birthright marriage, if you birthright citizenship, are just overwhelmingly strong in terms of the history, even though we have gotten exactly into the opposite position today, which creates its own tragedies with broken families, children can stay and parents are going to be forced out and so forth. I do think those rules ought to be changed as a general matter to what they probably were under the original version of the Equal Protection Clause. But still, I mean, to me, I'm more worried about the strategy question. And I would like to see this thing go as fast as we can, being well aware of the fact that it's the great fear of the low probability event, which is not going to follow previous patterns, which I think is a lot of the uncertainty that drives this. Now, Ejan, do we have any questions?